already called upon violence in video games, and to inform you guys, it's violence in video games. There is, of course, some we can use it as a theme in in serious games as well, but that is mainly an effect that is in entertainment games. So we will generalize it to video games as a whole. The whole thematic about violence in video games is very media effective since the late 90s, like the early Counter-Strike days. That was the first like prominent instance where the media picked up on it. And it's used as a theme in games throughout the years. And as the media picked up on the theme, there of course were people wanted to have proof whether or not there is an influence, positive or negative. So in the late 90s, the first studies were made, and later on we are gonna look at one of the more earlier studies from the early 2000s, and the results of these studies and the opinions of in the media and people in general, they have been very controversial throughout the years, because neither side has like persistent proof for their arguments. But to put it in perspective, most of the experiments and surveys and studies that have been done to evaluate if there is an impact, found that there is an impact, and most of them also found that there's a, you would call it, negative impact, so that violence in games produces violence in real life. But as I said, we are going to take a closer look at that statement further down the line, and especially what a really big where you have to differentiate is short and long-term effects of violence in video games, because if you're there's a difference, of course, if you're just there's adrenaline in your system after you played a very exciting session of a game, or if you have persistent aggressive behavior a half a year or a week or a day later. So we're gonna take a look at this particular survey. So the method that was used here is a study from the US, and there were 607 participants in total. They're equal in boys and girls from 4 different schools in the Middle East. For some selection bias, they took 1 private school, 2 public schools, and 1 religious public school. Yeah. And they only took the 8th and 9th grade students. When the consents, of course they had to contact the parents beforehand, and above 90% of the students participated, so there's a lot of variety in terms of what students are participating here. And they also only did this study in mandatory classes, so there is less selection bias there as well. And of course it was an anonymous survey, so people could be more honest about their answers. They took the following variables into account. So the amount of violence that the video game exposed the player to, how much the person played video games, how much prejudice or hostility the person was exposed to or has in them. The parental limit the individual student were set by how often they got in arguments with teachers. That one was taken by the teachers. How their grades were, and how often or if even they got into actual physical fights. All of these variables were defined by Likert scales, depending on the variable they reached from 1 to 7 or from 1 to 5. Yeah. And before we got to the results of that particular study, they got some, or in fact 6 hypotheses about the outcomes, so that violence in video games is positively correlated with trade hostility, positively correlated with aggression in real life settings, I would say for short, and that trade hostility moderates and mediates aggressive behavior. And also that the amount of the playtime is negatively related to the academic performance, so the more you play, the worse the grades get, and it is not associated with aggressive behavior. So, whether or not you're playing or not is not a factor on its own. And the model that was used to interpret the results is the GAM, the General Aggression Model. Just to quickly run you through it, because I know it's a lot of arrows and a lot of text. So we have on the top part there is like the biologic modifiers and the environment that the person is living in, and they conclude to the personality. So the top part, the green one, in fact, mostly states that you have your personality that, of course, affects how aggression is perceived. And of course, then the following inputs appear: the person that are around you, and also the situation that you're in, if you're in a classroom setting or doing sports or whatever. And of course also the social encounters that you have had prior to that, which also of course influence your personality, but you kind of familiar or not familiar with the situation that you're in, so that also affects your behavior. And then the block in the middle here, can you see the block in the middle here, where your like inner thoughts are, or your interior behavior interact with each other. So how your feelings and motivations internally interact with each other, and then that determines how you actually behave to the outside, how aggressive you are. To go into more we can go into more detail with this model afterwards, but just to give you a brief overview. So the results are pretty blatant, that all the hypotheses were found to be correct. So to start off, I've got some, hopefully that's readable, the resolution on these diagrams are pretty bad. We will do that for 2 of the hypotheses here. We can do more later on if you like. So we can see that the correlation between the violence that you are exposed to and the amount of play that you do correspond in hostility. When you are playing a lot of violent games, you're getting more hostile to each other, and that also then results in physical fights more often than for test subject that had less experience, less exposure to violence, or played less. of the same thing. One thing that's really clear in the study is that there's a big difference between boys and girls. So the boys got into aggressive, into physical fights and the violence in games much more often, and thought that that violence is a bigger part of the game that they want to play, where the girls mostly wanted very little violence in the game. Secondly, the second hypothesis that I want to talk about is that the more you play, the worse your grades get. So we are on the top part here. We have that the amount of playtime and the grades are negatively correlated with each other. So you indeed are getting worse grades when you play a lot, especially in violent games. And you are also getting into way more arguments with teachers when you are playing violent games, especially when you're playing a lot of them. If you want, we can go through the other hypotheses that are stated here, and I can elaborate on there are a lot of tables here that we can talk through how where they got these conclusions from. Do you think that that is a...
Let's start with the last one you just said first. The second one, the teaching time, playtime correlation with grade outcome. Is that relationship linear? Meaning, the more I play, the worse it gets, and most of all, isn't there a possible learning effect possibly on games as well? I mean, we were in a serious games, we constantly waste time arguing that there may be some cognitive benefits and using some audiovisual media apparently in order to stimulate some learning, I guess. So wouldn't it be sensible to assume that a moderate amount of play or minimal amount of play could have possibly positive effect on grades? You know what I mean? So that the relationship is not linear, but it's actually, I don't know, quadratic. I don't know. The more you play, and suddenly it becomes ugly, right? So if you play more than 5 hours per week or something, then your grades will decay, right? But until then, they don't. So is there any indication of that linearity or the nature of the relationship? Because it's easy to say that, but it basically means as soon as you start playing 1 minute of games per month, right, your grades will, however moderately, affect it, which is probably not the case, right? So it would be just interesting to see where this cutoff sits, right? So
I think they set a cutoff on 7 hours a week, because it was in the questionnaire about if you play more than 7 hours a week.
That was the question.
Right.
More.
So the assumption is
they have might be some bias for those defining variables, but they set up in the questionnaire.
This is important to tell us, right? This is important to report in a discussion, right? So because then because that could be a shortcoming to some extent or a feature of that particular study, if you like, right? Because 7 hours a week, that's the whole workday, guys, So if you play more than one workday per week, guess what? Your grades will suffer. That's a prediction I don't need to study for, right? So I mean, but if it's like half an hour and it gets worse already, then it would be interesting, right? So I think that's important to bear in mind, right? Those are massive nuances. So is that literally the cutoff, the lower level cutoff?
I think it's the...
Yes. That's the cutoff, so 7 hours a week.
Right, okay. Okay, yeah.
But I also think that they also put the Likert scale on the amount that they play, that the students should be honest about of how much they themselves think that they're playing. If they're playing too much, or if it's too much, or if it wouldn't be a big deal if they played more. I think, if I remember correctly, there was a question about that as well.
Yes, because participants were also asked about the amount of time they are using for school purposes, like doing homeworks and something like that.
And also reading and listening to music.
Yeah.
So
They
that was not the only activity that was on the questionnaire too. So it's not like this that they try to find out how about the playing the games, and we forget about the other activities you have at home. So
Right.
they are included in some form.
There's the interaction.
In this,
Oh yeah, yeah.
questionnaire.
Amount of video game play, amount of watching TV, and amount of reading for pleasure. So they ask the students about their free time usage.
Mm.
I would say, and how. As you maybe as you can tell from this graph here, that watching TV and watching video games is not really a big difference in your grades. If you're watching a lot of TV, that has the same effect. So you could draw the conclusion there that it's not the video games that are the evil part there, but the time not spent on learning is the evil part there.
Your justification is sensible, but looking at the actual outcomes there, it's quite surprising. So I'm better off watching TV than playing video games, because my grades were however slightly still be better. Is that a possible conclusion I can draw? So video games are really destructive, whereas TV is only moderately distracting from my learning efforts?
Yeah, they here categorize them as
Is that
same
discussed?
level.
Is that discussed? I must admit I haven't looked at paper that same day. I did it with the first one. But is that discussed? Because that's an interesting one. Because games supposedly have interactivity, whereas TV deprives people of precisely that, right? So, so why is suddenly an interactive medium more disruptive with respect to learning efforts than a non-interactive one? This is an interesting question, I think, to ask.
I think in these tables there are video games in general, not only the viral games. On the first line, if I read correctly.
Perhaps Clara has an answer.
I think the first line on the table is about the video games in general, not only violent games.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah. That's the premise I made.
So, but
I think Clara has a point.
In the paper that like 90% of the participants, they admitted that parents don't check what they are kind of playing. So this could be on player's choice. What
right.
the game do are we
I see.
picking?
Okay.
So this.
Yeah.
I'm saying like they do have very similar numbers across. The like largest differences between the physical fights.
Yeah, that's why I said before the grades. Yeah, the physical fights. So.
And that your comment about like engagement of if you're sitting and watching TV, are you really that engaged? Whereas if you're playing a game, you're that much more engaged. And like, is that engagement what's translating to the physical fights or the
Interesting.
like the trend to it? But I think your previous comment about the trends and time, because the amount of like reading for pleasure, did they give it the same like 7 hours a week?
Then I would actually take a look into that.
Yeah, I would have to take a look. I don't recall the exact numbers.
Because then you may end up with a trend of like, well, that's 7 hours not spent on your schoolwork, so does it matter if it was like
or if
constructive
the activity
or not?
at all is relevant, or that activity in general.
I want to add some comment. I think the grades are too general a little bit, because games can be helpful in some subjects, but not helpful in other. So I mean, and it depends on the personality also. Like, I don't know, if you play Counter-Strike, you may be good at like geometrics, or I don't know, the math. It may improve probably your math skills, but when you sit all day in one place, maybe bad for your physical subjects. I think the grades should be, maybe in the future work, I think the grades should be more deeply analyzed, because I don't think it has really high impact to the grades. I think it has, but not that much. So, but also, yeah.
I think what they did for the grades was just the overall grades. So when you get your, I don't know what the English term for that.
Transcript.
Yeah, thank you. When you get that and you just add up everything and then divide it by the number of subjects.
So
and,
the average.
I think they just
Average, yeah.
average. They just wanted to know the average grade a particular student had.
What did you think about the free time activity, like the first 3 lines? So it's kind of obvious what's most disturbing in terms of getting the grades. So you're
Yeah.
frankly wasting time.
Yeah.
Give your children a book.
Good luck, but sure.
Yes?
Yeah, just a comment because like I kind of disagree with that like general things that this causes this, but it's a obvious correlation, I guess. But if the like for example for the grades, if the cutoff is at 7 hours a week, then you will have people playing 20, 30, 40 hours a week. That for example struggles socially at school and they are like hiding in the basement playing video games all the time and they will steal data here maybe. I don't know if that is discussed.
So no, they just said 7 hours, yes or no.
Oh, really?
I remember. So you would suggest something like you stage that like 1 to 0 to 1, 2 to 5, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, somewhat like that.
Yeah, I think that would be a big difference, I think, in like the general results. I think it matters a
Yeah.
lot because there's some personal differences.
Yeah. So what you're saying is basically that the bucket, the bucket on the right side is probably way too big, right? So because the spread is too large, and
A little bit more.
and then since the standard deviation, since the mean is disproportionately influenced by outliers, it could be that there are those extreme cases that really live in the basement effectively and forgot about school, maybe disproportionately influencing the outcome, right? So having more fine-grained measure or a metric that you're suggesting. Good point, actually.
That would be also applicable to the other like TV reading and
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest issues with the way they measured here is that how much violence is in the games you play. That is a question. I think that's really hard to answer. They had to note down their top 5 or 3 games that they play. So you kind of can associate what a person perceives as violent, non-violent by that, but I think that's at least questionable. You should talk about that.
Yeah, it's just an additional comment about Niklas that I don't think they really do a good job describing like the causal relationship. For example, do video games cause violence, or does violent kids tend to play more video games, for example?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's the inversion, right? So the directionality. What causes what? Does the games, right?
They write about it
Yeah?
in the
Okay.
paper that this is by the bidirectional causality about
But it's a bit of a chicken egg thing, right?
Yeah.
So when do you play? When do you start, right? Or what initiates what, really, right? What's the trigger? I mean, for example, for example, example could be childhood bullying, right? So in our first exposure, going to school and so on, constantly bullied, so brings you to video games. Then you have an external trigger, certainly, but it will basically spiral from an external event to motivating to play those games and just to intensify this predisposition, basically. So meaning the games acted as a modifier to some extent, right? Similar to the general aggression model that you highlighted at the bottom.
Yeah.
There's this spiral thing, right? So but you wouldn't know, right? So it's really hard to isolate those two effects. Or is it just the games that make it ugly because you have for the first time seen, oh cool, that's a violent game, let's play it, and suddenly I get aggressive. So I don't know, there's a comment there.
That's
Yeah, I just like comment about how there's a lot of things that seem to be correlating, but there's not necessarily causality between them. Like there's so many variables here that are missing. Like they say something about parental involvement, but there's nothing here about how the kids are doing socially or how their situation at home is. So like it was something that was mentioned earlier with people living in their basement and just playing video games. Like, there's always a reason behind why someone plays a lot of games, kind of.
Yeah, no, I think the main part, especially for the also for the parent influences, that the kids had to judge them by themselves and not like the parents or like a third party, which of course can't be said because not a third party can judge that because they have to live with the family for that to do so. But it's really hard to quantify and qualify parent limitations.
There's also an aspect of like, if you're a how little kid they are and your parents are always telling you to get off your video games, then do you register the video games as a negative, or do you register the video games as a positive because you enjoy playing them? So like, how do you?
Yeah, and that probably it's a very positive thing because you're not allowed to do so, so it's a good thing
Yeah.
to do.
So your preferences, and if you're rating yourself, like, oh yeah, I play 12 hours of video games a week, but like that's no problem. I'd be fine. But your fine to you might be like C in school and
For your
12
parents.
hours of games and a sport. And playing sports, you might like that might be more fine versus someone else's that's like I have to have an A and play no video games and so that.
Yeah,
Really
definitely.
is very big.
It's all of the data here is very subjected to the subject that is giving the data.
Interesting.
Yeah, and also our viewpoints are really biased, I guess, because we love games, so we don't want to see anything negative, like too much negative on this thing. So maybe
I actually forced myself to pick a paper that finds that there's a negative impact of violence
yeah.
when you play, because I don't think so, but
Considering that how old this paper is,
Mm.
from 2004,
Exactly.
I think
published today, that's from 2000.
Oh, okay, yeah, published in 2004. Then I think that if you chose something that was made closer to today, you would have gotten a lot more varied view on it, because it's a field that's been done a lot of research in, and if I remember correctly, the consensus today is kind of like that. It might affect someone who's already violent in a negative way, but it won't impact you more than watching TV, violent TV or something like that.
Yeah, that's also what I know about the current state of the art. But on the other hand, they also talk about that in the discussion part of the paper, about the future and how this will change. And the prediction that they are doing here is that over the course of time, because the graphics are getting better and stuff like that, that the influence will be increasingly bigger. So they take that into the scope, but it's also one of the earliest data sets that have been taken with regard to violence in video games. So I thought that would be kind of interesting to see like one of the first impressions that science made on it.
Just one more question. Do you guys know who made this? Like, was there a bias towards picturing it as violent? Was it made for someone? So
I don't know, that's always the question with these type of studies. Who pays for the study? So what outcome will be there?
Well, the
I don't know, I didn't check who these people are.
So we
would
already
be
in the kind of what's the possible threat for the validity of the study. So it's the same as the previous one. During those few years, the technology went forward. So I suppose the games that were violent at this time would not be treated as violent now. So this is also a bit of change about how realistic the violent games could be. So it doesn't mean that the people were so much different now than then, but they also have a bit different target for the aggression. Yes.
I think the popularization of variables here is pretty lucky, because they don't go into detail about what is what and simply means. They briefly mention the opinion between realism and what's anything? Companies. They just keep saying, well, that's fun. It's kind of understand what they mean by that.
Yeah, that always a very general statement in this paper. But I think that's also a bit due to that it's a very early take on it, so the differentiation between different types of violence was just not there at the time.
Society also changed a bit from the last 20 years. We have a little bit more common knowledge, or at least what we see as the violent or improper in games or on the TV or all the other aspects. So this also is something that this paper is placed in this technological environment and the societal environment from this time. So yes, on some way, when it's published, then it's updated. You could say if it's a very big dynamics in the society and the technology. So probably somebody's playing bloody games and looking at the red square coming out of the two other squares in different color would not treat it as the bleeding now, but it could look quite violent and disturbing those days. So
True.
then the time of the study, I think it's quite important to have in mind while analyzing the studies also. So.
And was this study only conducted in an American school or in the American school
Yeah,
system? Because,
in 4 Middle East American schools.
because I also would presume that there would be differences in different countries with different educational systems and different cultures and media and stuff like that.
But what actually is pretty interesting that the data set that is collected here is prior to 9/11. So that whole discussion has not been taken into account when the data was gathered. So of course, published in 2004, that maybe had an influence on the media reaction had an impact on the content and the conclusions that have been drawn in the paper.
Yeah, but I think it's, the point Morten is making is sits slightly deeper in the sense that it has still been collected in at least Anglophone university or student settings, school settings, right? So in the Middle East you mentioned, and in US.
Or in the Middle East.
In the Midwest.
Only.
It's called the Midwest.
Midwest.
So in the US, so it's totally in the North American continent. So your point is, had they done the same study, right? So with the same kind of questions and the same kind of issues and all that in Scandinavia, question is there.
Asia, Africa.
That's right. So especially if you have a very different contrasting, cultural setup, make and principles and so on, would that have led to the same outcome? That's basically your question, and that's something you couldn't answer even if you know that it was done before 9/11 or Columbine or and all of this events.
Columbine.
Sorry?
Columbine was 99.
Yeah.
97.
Oh yeah. Okay.
97.
Yeah.
Right. So Columbine was already done. So you had already media impact then, because that was the biggest one, right?
The media started picking up on this in, as I said, late 90s. And there's also the first studies about the topic from I think 1998, something like that.
Right.
That's
Anyway,
the first
that would be
things
interesting.
about that I found.
But it may be interesting to follow up and see if anyone finds something from Scandinavia or elsewhere. Really, it doesn't matter on a similar issue, right? Because that could be present interesting additional insights. It's a bit tricky now, of course, because you're comparing with apples and pears, right? So you would need to use the same methodology and metrics that they have used, but. Interesting question.
I also, in the media discussion post-Columbine, so for those that don't know the Columbine shooting, it was a student went into the school and shot many of their classmates. And so that changed the perspective and the dialogue of, interestingly, games and like punk culture and video gaming and kind of underground culture. But video games became the point of discussion, not music, not sports, not any kind of other extracurricular activities. It was only video games that were targeted in such a way that, oh, it's the video game's fault for this type of violence, but there was not the same strong kind of focus on the TV or the music videos or the music or the other media that the kids were being exposed to. They kind of went like, hate video games.
Yeah, I think that's kind of related to that. There already had been a discussion about TV, music, and all of the other influence prior to that, when that was the new technology thing whatsoever. So when they already had a viral media impacting discussion about that punk or rock music is badly influencing kids, students, children's. That's
On the other hand, the video games were quite obvious and easy to take a shortcut, because another thing is to hear the music and someone singing about killing, and the other thing is to watch TV, to enjoy it or not, and the complete difference is that it's you that turning the trigger, although it's on the screen. So this is kind of the very easy shortcut and easy to explain to the publicity. So I'm not surprised that games were kind of the target of all evil coming from this one.
Mm.
But actually, this we see on this study. So the grades are not more affected of the violence in the games more than the games itself.
Mm.
So it's kind of the on this one.
Yeah, then I have one fact. Like, I live with my roommate. He's from Norway, and all the weekends he plays the game because I hear the noises, like emotional. And he's not aggressive. He has really good relationship with his friends, and he has really good grades for the fact, like, because he has like team of friends. He studies together with them, and he plays the games with them, and he has really good impact. I think this also impacts to your like grade and your like friends. You know, like if you have better friends and you're learning with your friends, I think it's kind of helpful. It doesn't matter, and it also depends on the personality. But I have never seen anything aggressive from this guy. Probably he's aggressive in the games, or I don't know. Yeah.
Yes, but on the other hand, you became kind of the neutral to killing. So you begin to touch another aspect of the violence in the games. That if it's nothing to kill, like you get used to killing in the game.
Yeah.
So then you just go cold-blooded out. You're not aggressive. You're just playing outside.
Something similar.
So this is the different aspect, I think, that we could discuss in this context.
That other studies researched upon is when you play violent games, that your perspective, what is violent or aggressive, shifts in real life, so that to put it very blatantly, the killing in the video game makes it shoving people in real life is not perceived as being aggressive by the person that is doing it. That's a claim that another paper that I've read made. And for their study they could confirm it, that there is a connection there.
Can you say that about anything? Like, if you see a lot of wars and death in the news, will that make you less, like, when you get exposed to it in your life, will it make you less emotional?
you could argue that from that point of view, yeah.
So I mean, I feel bad if I'm rude to a video game character. So.
Yeah. Always during the last checkpoint.
So it's a complex thing. Yeah.
Just another comment. I checked up just a little background. I saw 2 of the authors were linked to, just because I found it interesting, National Institute on Media and the Family, which were to some degree known for propagating values of the founder of that institute. And they are also claimed in 2005 reporting a zombie video game which were promoting cannibalism to people. So that was a bit interesting to just...
Cannibalism, okay, interesting. Okay. It sounds counterintuitive, but interesting.
Let's not go into this.
No, let's stop right here.
You will keep the channel.
That's right. I need to delete that. Whatever has been said in the last 1 minute. Spoiler alert. All right. Cool. Well, thank you very much. I think that what has happened here is that even though we haven't seen any serious game or not so serious game that actually showed us some violence, especially for the ones that don't have the prior exposure, I think we have nevertheless had a very extensive discussion, both based on the papers but also more or less based on personal experience to some extent. But I think the main outcome, it seems that it's a very complex issue, right? So it's just not easy to answer that with one simple study. So I think a meta-analysis approach is probably the one to go. And I think what you can take away from here, the metrics that you apply are really important, right? So in most cases, we had a call for some qualitative metrics. So what is your background? You know, how you're actually ticking in the widest sense. The other one was having more fine-grained scales, like looking at, for example, the hours you play. If you're cut off at 7 hours, well, interesting, and so on, right? So you had a lot of, and here the idea of decomposing grades, right? Perhaps quite the opposite. Perhaps if you're actually studying natural sciences and it's about spatial perception or something, you may actually have superior outcomes if you play spatial games, let's say like Counter-Strike. Whereas if you're looking from a social behavioral perspective, right? So that may be somewhat counterintuitive, which may be disproportionately reflected in your curriculum, right? So it's another thinking, right? So how important are certain aspects of grades for your total grade and others and so on. Anyway, so it's a very complex issue. I think I think we could run an entire course on this, just decomposing it, on constructing a perfect methodology for data collection before then actually doing it, because by that time the course would be over. But other than that, I think it gave us a good baseline for good discussion. So we took something away from here in many respects. But it's also worthwhile following up. So it's not just need to be aware that's not carved in stone. That's research in motion in the widest sense. So that's something to take home as well. But in any case, thank you very much for the discussion. And that's it, I guess, for today. Right? Thank you very much. Who's next week?
Next week.
Yep, and you.